I'm Rajiv Chandrasekaran, head of the Seattle-based MS Project and a senior advisor to the Schultz Family Foundation. I helped to lead Schultz's work on the index, but today I'll be serving as a moderator, channeling my 2 decades of experience as an editor and reporter at the Washington Post. Thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. The American Opportunity Index is a groundbreaking scorecard that ranks large companies by how well they create economic mobility for their workers. The index assesses the 250 largest US public companies based on real-world experiences of more than 3 million of their employees. It's unprecedented in its focus on worker outcomes, not on corporate policies or practice. It was compiled through a big data analysis of career histories, job postings, and salary sources. Importantly, the index studies the progress of workers in jobs that are open to those without a degree. The index measures which companies are most likely to create opportunity for their workers across 3 criteria: access, defined as those who are able to join a company; wage, how well they're paid; and mobility, how far a worker will advance, either at that company or once they leave for another company. Key findings from the index have revealed that where people work is absolutely critical. Workers at companies at the top end of the index earn almost 2.5 times more than their peers in the same roles at companies at the lower end of the index. Across a range of roles, this can translate into a difference of as much as $1.5 million over the course of the career of a worker. What your employer does matters. Workers at companies ranked high on the index get promoted a year faster on average than workers at companies ranked lower on the index. After 5 years, workers at well-performing firms will advance almost 3 times further. To discuss the index and really delve into it, I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists today, who are the key architects behind the index. Joseph Fuller is a professor of management practice and general management at the Harvard Business School, and he co-leads HBS's Managing the Future of Work initiative. He currently teaches the General Management Process and Action course in the 2nd year of the MBA program. Joe's also a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and was a founder, first employee, and longtime CEO of the Monitor Group, now Monitor Deloitte, the global consulting firm. And Matt Siegelman, who's the president of the Burning Glass Institute and chairman of Lightcast. At the Burning Glass Institute, Matt works to advance data-driven research and practice on the future of work and the future of learning. Previously, Matt was CEO of KKR-backed Lightcast, formerly MZ Burning Glass, the global authority on the talent market. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a visiting fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Gentlemen, let's jump right in. Everyone on this webinar should be broadly familiar with the American Opportunity Index, but some of us may have just taken a brief spin through the website or only read the lengthy Wall Street Journal piece that ran over the weekend. So while we talk about how this groundbreaking index was compiled, and we'll do that in a moment, I want to start with both of you with the key learnings, the headlines, if you will. And let me start with you, Joe. And Matt, please jump in too. What are the most important and interesting conclusions from this analysis for each of you?
Well, for me, Rajiv, I think the first is that where you do start your career matters a lot, and that's true within an industry as well as across industries. Not all big banks or big tech companies or big retailers are created equal, that the consequences over a 5-year period are profound, and we're talking about, of course, the consequences for the people that are featured in a lot of our conversations about the economy and our politics today, not those people who've got a 4-year degree and therefore probably have a jump start into the labor market to get in a good position, but people who are qualified for middle skills jobs. I think the final thing I would say is that company practices matter a lot. We've looked at 9 specific practices. This Bills on Work that I've done and other projects I've cooperated on with Matt, and that it's not just what a company declares it's going to do, not what the board of directors has been reassured that the company is doing, not what it says in policy manuals. It's what actually happens. In terms of the implementation of processes, the commitment to processes, the investment in processes. That creates dramatically different outcomes For workers, yes, but also for companies. Companies that help their workers rise with those workers. And I think the findings of this are really going to advance the conversation about how companies should approach that task.
What stood out to you, Matt?
I think a lot of us are rightly concerned about intergenerational mobility. If you were born in the 1940s, you had a 90% chance of out earning your parents. If you were born in the 1980s, that was down to about even odds. And to Joe's point about corporate practice mattering, one of the things that to me stood out from this is that when it comes to the field of economic advancement, when it comes to the work that's been done to chart how people achieve mobility, we tend to focus a lot on worker mobility in isolation from everything else. So what training people have accrued, what skills they're invested in, what degrees they earn, even their personality. Do they have grit? Do they not? What stood out here is that what we've often been missing in that equation is the kind of practices and policies of where you work. So when we think about opportunity, we have to think about it in a multidimensional way, and we have to think about the role that companies play in each of those dimensions. We talk about opportunity creation. We mean, first of all, the access to opportunity that that companies provide. Can you get on the ladder? The mobility that's provided. Can you climb up the ladder? And the pay. Do you earn enough to be able to stay? That's important because when we can break it down to those three dimensions, we can start to understand what drives success for workers. And one of the things that we found in this is that, in fact, you've companies to be able to support their workers effectively need to be good at least two of those three.
There's also, you make really important points about the value of this index for workers. Too many workers who've been left behind in the past generation. But there's value here also for companies themselves in a very competitive labor market. And as we head to potential economic headwinds in the future, as they have to more effectively manage talent. Joe, help us understand the value of this for companies that want to succeed in a competitive environment.
Well, I think the first is that more and more companies are going to focus on, for lack of a better term, growing their own talent. A lot of companies historically have relied on what I describe as a spot market for talent. They wait to the last possible minute to look for someone. Then they often find themselves looking for the exact same type of talent as other employers in their region. Great illustration of this would be the explosion demand for cybersecurity techs, where no one had any, and then all of a sudden everyone needed them, and that meant companies were fighting tooth and nail for each incremental person. So companies that can cultivate their own talent and match that talent to their emerging needs stay out of that bumptious spot market for labor. They're also going to help themselves in terms of fulfilling their commitments made often publicly on the diversity, equity, and inclusion front. Your entry-level workers, lower wage workers are more diverse than your middle and upper wage workers. And many companies are urgently trying to improve their performance on DEI. I think the level of sincerity and breadth of commitment in corporate America on that front is unrivaled. I genuinely believe that companies are committed to that goal, but they are doing it by stealing each other's diverse talent. They've got a foundation in their frontline workers and their first level supervisors that is more diverse than the rest of their population. They should be using these tools to advance those people through the ranks. And frankly, this is also going to be the type of index that investors who are attuned to social outcomes, social impact investing, even the big asset managers who are now increasingly expecting companies they invest in to demonstrate their commitment on ESG category issues. I think companies that think about their position in the index and adopt the policies and practices that are consistent with good outcomes for those workers will also be rewarded by the capital markets.
This is
And-
truly some of the best and in some ways only real empirical data to help define the S in ESG.
That's right, and many chairmen of audit committees and CEOs are anxiously awaiting what the Security and Exchange Commissions have to say about reporting requirements as it relates to the S and ESG. They've already said that companies are obliged to report material issues that relate to staff, to human resources, but they haven't gone beyond that. I think we can anticipate in the not too distant future specific explicit reporting requirements on diversity, on wage distribution, and maybe, I hope, on upward mobility.
Now,
And I would say, Joe, just to add to that, so certainly agree that mobility, I think, is going to be something that is going to be increasingly tracked, both because, to your point, I think corporations have real sincerity about worker advancement and worker well-being, and because there's going to be a growing set of stakeholders outside the company. But Rajiv, to your question, I think, and Joe, to the points you made before, I'll just add a couple of data points rather behind some of what you shared about why this, even if there are no external stakeholders who are applying this pressure, why this should matter so much to companies. Joe, you summarized essentially 4 sets of business values that are unlocked through worker mobility: talent attraction, talent retention, promotion, and productivity. And I think just quick data points on each of them. From an attraction perspective, when we measured companies against various access metrics. So on the one hand, Rajiv, to your point, access is, okay, are we creating opportunity for workers? But read the other way, companies that were topping the scale on attraction, on access rather, were 4 times as likely to hire somebody without a degree or without experience. That's dramatically expanding the pool of talent that they can tap. From a retention perspective, companies that are topping the scale on retention metrics had experienced double the retention, employee retention, over 5 years of companies at the bottom quintile on retention. From a promotion perspective, likewise, we see people going 3 times as far up the career ladder at top quintile companies. And as people rise, they are gaining value to the company. So across all of those, I think there's compelling business evidence that says this is something that should be on the map for companies.
So let's talk a little bit about how this index was pulled together. But before we do, both of you have been really looking at issues of economic opportunity for workers in different contexts for quite some time, from your respective perches in academia, in consulting, and running MZ Burning Glass. So I want to just start off by asking you a little bit of the why here. There are a lot of approaches those who care about economic mobility can take in helping to promote it. Why an index? What's the impetus for this, and what's the value of it for both of you? And let me start with you, Matt, since you've been doing a lot of the grinding here and helping to pull this together.
Well, grinding was equally shared, but Joe's got a pepper mill and behind him somewhere on that desk. But either way, I'll simply say this: that an index is, put in different words, is a yardstick, and we felt that yardstick is something that employers have been missing to date. As we both said, employers have had a lot of sincerity about wanting to do right by their employees, but haven't necessarily had a way of measuring something like worker mobility. So one, we wanted to be able to advance a set of measures that could be replicated that companies could use internally. Two, we felt this is a good way of helping companies track their performance. Three, having an index and having a set of measures behind that index allows you to set goals and to create effective benchmarks.
If we made a list of the 6, 8, 10 major objectives of large companies relative to providing a safe and attractive working environment, good opportunities for workers, I would wager that 100% of the Fortune 250s would check off every single box that they are doing those things. And I regularly meet with senior executives in companies, and we talk about what they're doing, and they're excited and anxious to tell me about the various things they're doing. But it has to do with their intentions and high-level policies. By now providing them a look into how those policies are playing out in terms of results, we're providing companies not a scorecard to be manipulated, that if they're number 49 in one of our measures, their objective should be to 48, but a basis to ask themselves more specific, more direct, and more honest questions. If we're designing a lot of jobs that are fairly simple, therefore fairly low productivity, therefore fairly low wage, therefore fairly high turnover, is that really serving our economic interests? If we see that we have competitors on the list that do not require a college degree of an applicant, why do we still require one? If we are a company that has a very high ratio of entry-level workers to supervisors, and therefore is never going to grow fast enough to afford lots and lots of those entry-level workers the opportunity to advance inside the company, are we consciously helping them develop marketable skills that allow them to progress in their careers elsewhere while continuing to think highly of our company and how we help them launch on a pathway that led to economic independence and security for their families? So the what we really want to do is we're not this is not a name and shame exercise. It's not a index where what we're trying to get people to do is make very specific decisions. We're asking them to reflect on their business models, observe the actual empirical data-based outcomes, and ask if they'd like to change those outcomes and give them some guidance into how to do it.
Thanks, Joe. And let me build on that. Matt, why is the index only ranked the top 50 overall?
Well, I think there's two reasons. One, to Joe's point, this is not a name and shame exercise. This is first and foremost for me about making sure that we can advance a set of measures that track access, mobility, and pay, the key drivers of opportunity creation. Second, and I think this is really important as well. One of the things that was most surprising to me in looking at the results of all of this is how widespread good practice is. Joe just talked about how different companies have different business drivers, have different business models. And ultimately, this is about aligning opportunity creation to those business models. It's not necessarily about changing business models, but about asking important questions about practice. So that's why we, on the one hand, created a overall top 50 list, but at the same time, we created 5 distinct models of opportunity creation we call archetypes. Essentially think about them each as representing a different motor of opportunity. So it looks pretty different if you're a company, for example, which pays really well, has treated employees really well, and people as a result have rewarded their workers have rewarded companies back by sticking around a long time. Well, if people are staying around a long time, then that may not be the best place for a lot of mobility, because the people above you aren't leaving. But on the other hand, that may be a very good and productive model for some companies. It's a distinct one from companies that help people get in, move up, move along.
And we'll come back to that in a moment, because it's one of the more innovative features of this index. It's not just a 1 to 250 rank, but these 5 archetypes, these 5 motors, and recognizing different strengths that companies have in creating opportunity for their workers. Matt, I want to get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts here. How was the index actually assembled? How were all of these career histories compiled, and how were accurate comparisons made among workers in different firms?
So first of all, I want to thank Lightcast and Glassdoor for their generosity in providing very powerful data sets. Part of what allowed us to construct this index, and why I think it's taken till now to do it, is that the kind of data sets that we're talking about haven't necessarily been available in the past, and certainly not with the breadth and comprehensiveness with which the Lightcast data and the Glassdoor data represent workers' career histories on the one side and workers' pay on the other. So a couple of distinct things in terms of the construction of this. So we are, first of all, looking at real worker experience. So as Joe said, this is not a survey of practices or policies, but we studied the career histories of 3 million workers of Fortune 250 companies who were working in jobs that are open to those without a degree. We define that as jobs where at least 30% of people in the occupation don't have a degree. We then tracked those people over 5 years, so between 2017 and 2021, to understand how far do they rise, where did they end up, not just within the company, but beyond the company as well. So that combination of tracking real career histories, 3 million workers, looking at their progress, not just within company, but beyond, across 9 measures of access, mobility, and pay, allowed us to have quite a bit of comparability.
Why focus on outcomes instead of corporate inputs or practices? What's the power of this sort of empirical analysis as opposed to a inputs focused assessment, which perhaps by its very nature becomes more subjective?
Rajiv, let me dive in on that one. In some previous work that we sponsored here at Harvard, and that Lightcast and Burning Glass Institute were instrumental in conducting, what we found consistently is that senior executives ranked the effectiveness of their policies and practices in things like creating career pathways, providing clear and actionable and timely feedback, having supervisors who were engaged in trying to advance subordinates, was the rankings that C-suite executives gave themselves on those types of measures were a standard deviation better than the rankings that operating executives gave the company, which were a standard deviation better than the grades frontline supervisors gave the companies, and that the scores provided by frontline supervisors were far closer to those of low-wage workers and their estimation of the company's performance than they were to either of the other 2 categories of white-collar workers. So it's not whether you have a policy, it's whether it gets executed. And the way we know it gets executed is in the outcomes. So, and very important thing in the index is, of course, across companies, we look for occupational similarities. We're not comparing a customer service rep in American Express, which is a job that has that 30% or more non-college graduate threshold, with a laboratory technician in the research and development lab at Pfizer. Um, those people are compared with other people with that occupation, so that you're not, and it's another reason, of course, why we have the different archetypes, because the business models of companies give them more or less opportunity, just as a function of the industry they're in, to create certain pathways. And that makes this, and the fact that this is 3 million workers over 5 years, over 250 companies, is the type of analysis 25 years ago had been the intellectual equivalent of trying to build a pyramid, Great Pyramid of Giza. But now we've got the tools, and with the help of Glassdoor and Lightcast, the data sets to really start doing analysis in a way that's well beyond what we could have done even 5 years ago.
So let me just build on this, Joe, and turn it to Matt. This example of the comparison, we're not comparing the customer service rep at Amex to the scientist at Pfizer. So what you're doing here, Matt and Joe, is you're taking, you're looking at a range of occupations within companies, and you're comparing them to one another. But then you're adding up all the occupation scores to help create a company score. Is that how you did this, Matt?
That's right. A company is essentially the company's performance is the sum of the experience of each of its talent pools. So you're saying, okay, look, customer service representatives at Amex, how do they compare with customer service representatives at American Airlines? How do they compare with customer service representatives at Capital One? And you're not trying to say, okay, how does overall American Airlines compare to Capital One? They're entirely different animals. One thing I do want to say, though, in that regard, and Joe's right, industry matters. It reflects a business model, but we found that it mattered maybe a little less than we would have thought. It's not destiny. If you take, for example, the insurance industry, 4 of the top 50 employers are insurance companies, and 4 or 5 of the bottom 50 were also insurance companies.
And indeed, on the top 50 list, the index is broken, the companies on the index are broken into 27 sectors, and 21 out of 27 sectors are represented on the top 50 list.
Correct.
And 161 out of 250 companies overall are at least in one of the 50 best lists of recognition, these 5 archetypes that you had been speaking about and can be seen on the index. As we talk about comparing occupation to occupation, one of the points you made earlier, and that's a unique differentiator of this index, is it's only looking at roles open to non-college graduates. It doesn't mean that it's only non-college graduates in that role, but let me just ask you briefly why. Why just look at that as opposed to all roles in these 250 companies? Joe?
Well, I think a couple of reasons. One is, while it's unfair to say, gee, if you've got a college degree and you're going into a job that the vast majority of people in that job have a college degree, you don't have any problems. Life is going to take care of itself. Your ticket is punched, and God bless you. That's not fair. But if we look at issues of economic mobility, if we look at issues of that speak to the S in ESG, the population that's most deserving of additional attention in companies are workers in somewhat lower wage, high turnover positions. There's nobody at a Merck or a Pfizer that is ignoring the care and feeding of PhD biochemists that have been hired from Caltech, or MD MBAs or MD PhDs that they've hired into their research labs. The further you get up the income distribution, the higher your starting salary in companies, the more the monitoring of things like turnover and performance is better. the more attention paid by supervisors as to the progress and learning of subordinates is higher, because that's where the money is. And particularly in industries that have a fair number of entry-level jobs that are low wage, high turnover, the entire business logic is essentially based, including the way managers are taught to interpret data, that's some kind of historical inevitability, that the people come and go and all your processes are based on that assumption. We want to direct corporate attention to those areas in their organization that have not historically been given as much attention, and where we think improved performance will give them outsized gains as well as have more impact and critical issues like income disparities.
And just a reminder to everybody on this webinar that if you have a question, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A box on Zoom here. Let's delve in a little bit more to how this index was constructed. And I have a question, and I also want to bring in an audience question as well. Matt, don't the online sources that the index draws from, things like LinkedIn profiles, resumes posted to online job boards, and other sources, don't they skew more toward professional jobs? So how can you be confident about these conclusions with regard to non-professional occupations? And then let me just add in, coming in from the audience, how this index accounts for sampling errors.
Perfect.
From the online data sources.
Great. Let me, and I'll treat those questions together. First, absolutely, there is a skew in the kind of career histories that are able to be captured online. Full stop. The question is whether despite that skew, in other words, professional jobs are are better represented online. But despite that, is there enough data about people who are working in those kinds of jobs that Joe was just talking about, those kinds of jobs that don't require a degree, that we can make valid conclusions about whether they rise, and if so, how? And one of the things that's changed a lot over the last decade is not only the emergence of some of these big data type data sets like the LAGCAST career history database, but is also the comprehensiveness of that insight base. We have, as an example, as we were doing the analysis, as we started off asking this very question, and one of the things we found was about 75,000 career histories of people working in Amazon warehouses. Now, on the one hand, there's about 1 million of them. So you can, if you want to look at the glass as being half empty, you'd say, well, that's less than 10% of Amazon warehouse workers. On the other hand, if you're trying to look at statistical significance, do we have enough Amazon warehouse workers? Do we understand what happens to them within Amazon, beyond Amazon? I'll go out on a limb and say we do.
Matt, how do factors that are less in control of a firm or a worker, such as geography or local economic conditions, impact this analysis?
So geography, other kind of factors absolutely play in. And some of those factors we were able to take into account, as Joe described, our occupational control methodology, which certainly helped. But at the end of the day, there are sets of factors that we want to be able to, as we continue to improve and evolve this index over time, that we want to be able to factor in. So I think it's important to recognize what we've not been able to cover. Geography is one of them. Race, gender, ethnicity, other key factors that we think will have significant bearing on mobility and worker advancement, which we were not able to factor in here. Things like pay progression and the like. All of those are things which we've not been able to necessarily factor in here, and look forward to incorporating in future editions of the index.
It also, Rajiv, informed some of the construction of the archetypes, like the career stability archetype, would likely be collinear with very large employers that are a dominant employer in a region that doesn't have a lot of large companies. So if you work at a John Deere or a Snap-on tool or someone like that, you are not those workers are not surrounded by um, corporate headquarters in Moline, Iowa, as they might be in downtown Chicago or Manhattan or Washington D.C. The other thing I just like to say is uh, I know that some people may have read this as written for an effect, but we were very explicit that we're presenting these findings humbly and realizing this is a very complex exercise, and we're not putting this data forward to tell people you should do this, you should do that. We're putting this data forward to say you should reflect on this data and ask yourselves questions of relevance to your strategy, to your company, given your objectives, representations you've made to your shareholders, to your board, to the big asset managers and other shareholders. And one of the things that's interesting about the data is virtually every company, as you pointed out, does reasonably well on 2 or 3 of the specific measures. And it's the degree to which the puzzles are incomplete across companies within the archetypes that I think are quite interesting. That people, for whatever reasons, perspective of management, priorities of the board, nature of the industry they're in, have alighted on different patterns of activity. And we're asking them to look more broadly at that, at the very least reconfirm they're comfortable with the way they're conducting themselves and the degree to which they're actually implementing their policies in other domains.
Now, the overall scores for the companies are an average of the 9 metrics that you're looking at for each company. How did you decide how to weight the 9 in relation to each other?
So one of the things that was important was to make sure that we were factoring in 2 sets of input. One of those was what people who have worked around this space, who have studied it as economists, as worker advocates, as educators and others, what they could tell us about what really matters most for driving mobility. At the same time, we also wanted to make sure that we were hearing what workers had to say on this. And we were paying it close attention to what workers said matters, most of them as well. And so in addition to interviewing a dozen experts, we also surveyed 500 workers to find out what mattered to them. What we heard was consistent and clear. The pay that you make is really important. But workers were very clear, and the experts we spoke to were clear that having a clear pathway up, having the training needed to get there are equally important.
So, I mean, workers didn't say that wage is 99% of this?
No, we expected that workers, well, actually, I think Joe probably expected less than I did, but I had, I had some expectation that workers were going to be pretty loud and clear that what mattered most to them was to get paid. And workers are smart. What workers are trying, they're managing a calculus that balances what they're making today and what they expect to be making tomorrow. And so, I think they understand that investments in their mobility are just as important to them.
And this, Rajiv, really points out a perverse cycle in a lot of the companies of size in the United States, that management has an expectation there's going to be high turnover in certain job descriptions. Therefore, the job design is fairly simple because the job's regularly occupied by somebody who's new to it. But because it's simple, it's not that productive, and therefore it's not well paid. And the management says, and nor does it make sense for me to invest in enhancing the skills of those workers because they always leave.
It's a vicious cycle downward.
It's a vicious cycle downward. But the true cycle is a worker, very few people take jobs without fond hopes that this is going to work out for them, that this is going to be a good place for them where they'll make friends and be productive and be able to provide for themselves. And particularly lower wage workers have challenges in things like transport and care giving obligations. So when they get in a situation that a job they can get to and where the working hours work well for them and they start feeling they're productive, the actual cycle is I'm looking for a reason to stay, but my employer isn't giving me one. Therefore, if I can get 55 cents more an hour, a bus stop closer, why wouldn't I do that? And these two ships pass in the night, both not asking themselves the right question, particularly employers, which is, what could I, how do the economics of this actually work, given the fact it isn't a law of Newtonian physics that customer service reps or retail workers or food service workers always leave? That's just not borne out by the data.
So when it comes to waiting, just go back for a second. We talked to and heard from 500 workers as well as an expert panel. But I want to put you both on the spot. Of the 9, is there a metric that you think is most important, Matt?
Well, so first of all, I think we haven't today laid out what the 9 are, and so maybe I'll just take a second. So while I'm talking, people can vote for themselves. But I mentioned before that we measured access, opportunity, mobility. Access measures were relative to other companies hiring for this role. Does the company offer more or less, are more or less likely to hire somebody with a degree, or to look for somebody or to hire somebody without experience? Mobility is looking at how fast do people rise, how many levels do people rise over that 5 years that we looked at? For a given role, is the company more or less likely than peers to promote somebody from within? People leave. Do they leave to a better role? Do they stick around long enough for it to matter? Does the management team have people who are leading the company had that experience in mobility? They've risen from within. And of course, there's pay. For me, I think the 2 that I think kind of stand out are maybe those last 2 of mobility. One, for a given, does the team itself, does the leadership team itself have a culture of understanding upward mobility? Does that team come from within? That's important in setting a set of expectations and setting a set of beliefs that people inside the company can rise. Second, it's how that plays out in practice on the ground. Rubber meets the road of that culture is, for a given role, relative to my peers, am I more or less likely to promote someone into it?
I would answer that slightly differently. I'm going to give the most important for a worker versus the most important for a company. I think the most important for a worker is what we call the velocity of growth variable. Now that's how long it takes to move up one level. But every journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. So if you've got a company, if you're considering working at a company and it's got high velocity of growth, that could be a function of it's growing its market share, growing its revenue at a fast rate, but it means that you're not likely to be stuck in that initial job. You're less likely to be stuck in that initial job. It also suggests that the company is doing something, either recognizing you're qualified for advancement based on what you brought in the door the day you started, or they're doing some things to enable you to move forward, and they're interested in that happening. For companies, it's retention, which Matt was just talking about. If people are staying, people particularly in a tight labor market, do have alternatives. And if I'm keeping my people and I'm satisfied with their productivity and we're being competitive, that's a good sign that the total package is working. Doesn't mean I don't have questions to ask and ways I can improve, but that's for a company, that would be the surest indication that they're probably getting it more right than wrong, maybe considerably more right than wrong.
So we have about 5 minutes left here. So let's do a little bit of a lightning round here on how we all should actionize this, companies, workers, and so forth. But let me start with you, Joe, real quickly. What do you recommend companies should do with the findings of the index?
I think they should look both at companies that are in different industries that seem to be performing well, either in an archetype that they feel really relates to their strategy or their intended outcomes in terms of their HR policies, and look at those companies just for best practice ideas. Take if you don't have to be a telecoms or technology company to see if AT&T will receive a visit from several of your executives to talk about their philosophy of skills development. They happen to be number one in the overall index. Similarly, they should be looking inside their sector or at other sectors they think are highly analogous to their business model, and look at that kind of topology we prepared and ask, well, I'm underperforming my peer group on this one of the 9 dimensions. I'd like to understand how that could be, and investigate it. And you may find that you have strategic differences, as Matt said. Companies that do well in some of the sectors often have quite different profiles relative to the variables we looked at. But use the data to direct your inquiry to ask whether you can do things differently, either in terms of policy setting or, very importantly, execution of policy to drive better outcomes.
Thanks, Joe. Matt, what about for workers? How should they use this index?
So I think for workers, this is an important starting point, an important ingredient in making effective employment decisions. Joe described the importance of looking at, for example, a velocity metric or a combination of metrics. This provides workers with a way of evaluating not just what's the right place to land for convenience or whatever, but what's the kind of company that's going to make sure that they keep moving. Number one. Number two, by breaking out the different models of opportunity creation, it allows workers to align what matters most to them to how different companies are going to support them in moving forward. One of the things, Rajiv, that we learned from some of the past research that Joe and I did together is that workers rise. And actually some of the work that we've done together at the Schultz Family Foundation. Some companies rise with them, and workers deserve to know which ones those are.
That's great. Matt, will there be a year 2? What should we expect from the index going forward?
Well, Joe talked before about, so first of all, short answer, yes. And maybe in a lightning round, that's all I should say, but I'll just add this. Joe talked before about the humility with which we want to put this forward. And part of that is recognizing that this is the start of a conversation, not only internally in companies, but also for us. We already recognize some things that we want to be able to add to the index that will make it even more comprehensive going forward. We're looking forward to making sure that worker advancement continues to be on the table, and that we make this as effective a tool as it can be toward that end.
And I have one other lightning round question for you, Joe. Recognizing that on this webinar, they're not only representatives of many of the large companies that are assessed through the index, but those working with a range of American employers on issues of mobility. Beyond the top 250 that the index assesses, are there takeaways here for all employers, particularly, let's say, mid-size and smaller employers in the American economy? And in a couple of seconds, what are the highlights?
First is, the smaller you are, the harder it is to fight the spot market battle. So you want to grow your own. You want to be looking for talent that you think you can invest in. You do not want to create artificial scarcity of candidates by throwing up barriers to application like gratuitous degree requirements. And I think smaller companies ought to be looking, as I said earlier, at companies they admire in their sector or adjacent sectors that perform well and asking what are they doing and can we be borrowing some of their means of executing policies or adopting some of their policies. So to paraphrase Nike, they can be like Mike. And this is really a tool for provoking companies to ask better questions and reflect on what their objectives are and are they configured to meet those objectives, and it applies to a Fortune 1000 company or 2000 company as readily as a Fortune 250 company.
And to the audience, if you haven't already, we'd encourage you to explore the American Opportunity Index website at americanopportunityindex.org. That's americanopportunityindex.org, which you can find in the chat. And while there, you can download the report authored by Joe and Matt, explore interactive data visualization tools, and find stories about top performing companies. And check back to the website soon, as we will upload a recording of today's webinar to the site. Joe Fuller, Matt Siegelman, thank you very much for not just your participation here today, but to your vision and hard work in bringing the American Opportunity Index to life. On behalf of the team at the Schultz Family Foundation, it's been an honor to partner with both of you and your respective organizations. I realize for both of you, and particularly the Burning Glass side, it takes a team. And Matt, you've got a dynamic, smart, creative team there with you that has really helped to bring this groundbreaking assessment of how companies, large companies, create economic opportunity for their workers to life for the first time. So thank you all for joining, and please explore the index and reach out if you have further questions.